Life isn't perfect, and neither are we.
No, but we know how to face our fears
And have some fun.
and talk about all the messiest things of life.
Like the messiest things.
Get connected to yourself, get connected to others, and get connected to the life right in front of you.
This is The Connected Life with Justin and Abi.
That's me.
That's you.
And you. So Pizzi called me the other day.
Yeah, she did.
And-
like every day.
And she told me, Abby, you have to watch this TV show. And I'd heard from somebody else about the TV show. And it's not one that I generally would find myself drawn to. This genre of TV show. So, but as she was telling me about it, she said this. She said, Abby, me and Johnny both cried after the first episode.
And the miracle in that is that Johnny's a robot.
No,
and you know, if you're listening, Johnny, you know you're a robot.
Listen, he's cried. I've known him 13 years, and I think 5 times he's cried.
Yeah, we had a conversation. He's had a handful of cries.
Yeah. So he doesn't do it. So I decided I have to watch this show just to see what made Johnny cry.
Why is Johnny crying?
What is going
What's breaking him?
Yes. And then as soon as we watched it, we were hooked.
Oh yeah, I was like, oh, I know why it broke Johnny.
And so we binge watched the whole season. Although we tried not to because it was so good. We wanted to. We were
trying to space it out through a few days.
Yeah. And so binge watched, meaning we spaced it out through 1 week. I think is how long we lasted. But it was so amazing that then I started sending it, texting it to everybody. Yeah,
we were like social media blasting it.
Yes.
And then like all the people I know, I'm like, you have to go watch this now, really, and I'm giving them the best pitch ever.
Now here's the thing: everybody responds the way that I did. They're like, and because the genre is not something that a lot of people, some people aren't so drawn to.
Yeah.
So what ended up happening? Every single one of them, I peer pressured into watching it. I just kept like every day. Have you watched it yet? Have you watched it yet? I want to talk to you about it. Have you watched it yet? And like finally, after enough pushes, my friends started watching it. All of them.
Across the board, 100%.
Binging.
I'm getting wrecked. I can't believe this.
This is the best thing I've seen. This is the best thing that happened during the coronavirus.
There has to be more. Why isn't there more?
So there's only 1 season out, and when you get done with the first season, you're like, I have to have. Anyway, so
So what happened
why are we talking about this TV show for so long, Justin?
So there's a handful of things that happened here. Number one, I immediately was like, I have to get the creator of this on it.
Yes.
I'm like, I'm just going to get the creator on. That's how Justin is. He decides he wants something and it happens. And so I go and I find the creator. His name's Dallas Jenkins. And I was like, I found him on Facebook and I'm like, here's a couple mutual friends. They have to know him. I'm hitting them both up. And within less than a day, I all of a sudden have contact with Dallas and he's on our show today.
Yes. And we're so excited. So Dallas Jenkins created a show called The Chosen.
And The Chosen is a story not only about Jesus, but about Jesus and his disciples. And it goes into the deep human elements of their humanity and Jesus's humanity. And I have to say, Dallas, first off, thank you for being on here today.
Yes. Welcome.
Wow, thank you so much for that very kind introduction and for your enthusiasm for the project. It means a lot.
Yes.
Oh yeah, it's amazing. It's the most beautiful display of the nature of God that I've ever seen. Next to the shack, which we love. We love the Jesus and God that we see in the shack. But I feel like I'm seeing Jesus tangibly for the first time in my life in human form. And he's as good and as loving and even more so than I could have imagined in my heart.
Yeah, it's an amazing, amazing portrayal.
Well, thank you for that. It means a lot. I think that what you're responding to is a result of the fact that I have been a believer my whole life, since I was a kid. I've heard the stories of Christ hundreds of times. I was a Bible major in college. I went to Christian schools growing up. My father is a well-known Christian author. He wrote the Left Behind series. I have grown up immersed in the stories of Jesus. And I've seen all the Jesus movies and miniseries that have been done. And I think this show is as much a response to that as it is its own thing. Because I would watch Jesus movies and miniseries growing up and be like, I'm supposed to love Jesus a lot, but why are these so boring?
Yes.
And that's not to slam all of them. There's been a couple that have been good. And of course, The Passion of the Christ was very powerful. But the thing that was problematic with them for me was twofold, maybe threefold. But one of the main thing was first of all, Jesus' portrayal. He was always stoic.
Yes.
And typically British. He only spoke as though he was
quoting white. Sorry.
Yeah, well, right. But he only spoke as though he was quoting King James version scripture.
Yes.
The treatment of him was so reverent, which is good. We do want to revere that which we worship, but at the same time, it was so reverent that it was completely disconnected and emotionally distant. And so there was no understanding of why people followed this guy in droves like they did. And why he would have had any friends. It was just so the portrayal of Christ was one aspect of it. And growing up, my dad and I and my brothers, we were always, first of all, we were always kind of the class clowns, but part of that was we would do things a lot when I was growing up, saying things like, what was Jesus like when he was sitting around the campfire with the disciples? And what kind of food did he eat? Did they ever tell jokes? And we would always kind of imagine that kind of stuff. And it always did this. It always resulted in me. It didn't diminish Jesus' deity at all. It in fact enhanced it, because it was like the same person who inhabited this human body and had soreness and like I said, muscle aches and had to make his own food. All that stuff was also the God of the universe. That concept to me was actually really beautiful. So the second thing that I think the show is responding to is movies and miniseries always tend to go from miracle to miracle, Bible verse to Bible verse. You never really get a sense of the people who actually experienced these miracles, the people who chose to follow Jesus. And one of the things that makes a television show, especially a multi-season show, so compelling and makes you want to binge watch it, makes you want to follow it year to year, is the emotional connection that you have to the people
characters. Who are yes.
So Friday Night Lights, one of my favorite shows of all time. Breaking Bad, Downton Abbey, any of those shows, you're obviously the plot matters, but you're really invested in the people.
The characters, what's happening in their worlds, how are they responding to pain?
Who are they becoming?
And why is it then when there's a death or a romance or some sort of big moment in a show, you're so moved? It's because you've spent time with those people. So here we have Jesus would heal someone or do some big miracle or would call someone to follow him. And as we see in the Gospels, you see there, like Matthew at the tax collection booth, Jesus walks by, says, "Follow me." Matthew immediately drops everything and follows him. That's all we know from the Gospels. So if you portray that in a show, and you don't know who Matthew is.
No context. You don't care.
There's no emotional impact whatsoever. And so that is what The Chosen is about. And that's what it was birthed from, was this concept of, I want to know what the lives were like of these people. And I believe that if you can see Jesus through the eyes of those who actually met him, you could be impacted and changed in the same way that they were. But the only way that impact and change is impactful and changing is if you actually get to see what we call the before. And the before of Mary Magdalene, the before of Matthew the tax collector, the before of Simon Peter, the before of Nicodemus, which is a fascinating story, which we can get into in a minute. But the before of those people is what connects me and you when you're watching to it and go, wow, their problems are my problems.
Exactly.
They're struggling with what I struggle with. They're just as screwed up as I am. And that's what Jesus is, when he comes in and can impact that. Wow, maybe there's something for me. So that's what I think people are responding to.
And I gotta say this. We're all so excited. he chooses them in their humanity, which we know he did, but religious people and stuff don't actually connect with the idea that Jesus chose the people around them in the midst of their messiest humanity. And he goes, no, I see you. Come follow me. Come participate with me. And he loves them. And you see that displayed and you go, he does. He loves me. He loves me in all my messiness. He chooses me right here.
Well, and I can say so many of my friends will call me about a specific episode because they can see themselves in it. They're like, I am that desperate. I don't know what to do with this. I'm trying to perform my way into what I need to do. I'm trying to strive and make sure I've got all these financial stresses that I'm trying to figure out. And all of a sudden, what I thought is it makes what Jesus said and did matter. It makes it like, no, this is tangible and real, that he came for you. Even like him sitting with sinners, like it talks about the verses in the Bible where like he got in trouble for hanging out with them. But when you're actually watching a show where you're seeing, like I'm walking away being like, he came for the least of these. He didn't refuse people. You can actually connect to it because you're watching it. And I think that I do want to mention this really quick, and we're going to have you tell the story about how you create, like how this got birthed. But
can I throw this out there? As you're talking, I'm trying to keep myself from crying just even thinking about it right now. Anyway, sorry.
Yes, because it's so amazing.
Because it's so amazing. I'm literally holding myself together and I'm like, it's real.
Yeah. It feels like meeting Jesus for the first time, even though you've already met him. But one of the things I did want to mention, besides what you said about there being character development that drives this, where you actually feel connected to people. It feels more like a TV show than a God show.
Right. You're saying like a primetime TV show because of the quality and everything else in it.
Right. Okay. But this is what I wanted to say. One of the reasons I loved it, me and Justin were met in LA. We fell in love. He's a part of the film industry for a long time. So we think film industry wise.
Right.
And this is the first time. It's a great script. It's funny.
Yes.
It's witty. It's well written. Then there's great music. There's great production value. There's amazing actors. It's the first Christian thing I've seen besides The Passion, which Mel did good, with good actors. Like the actual production, you don't feel like so many times I'm watching things where I'm like, I'm trying to get the heart of this, but I'm having to push past how it is created. And so I just want to say that, and that's the last thing we'll beef up. But for all of you listening who you've seen all of the cheesy, like things that feel like you're having to let go of watching quality shows in order to have a experience what God's doing. This is a well done.
And I wouldn't compare this to I'm not even trying to beat up on this genre of Christian television, but I am trying to say I don't compare it to Christian genre. I compare it to the high quality, excellent media that is the standard that's existing out there today.
It's like a Netflix show.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's because it was inspired. Like when we're writing and watching other shows or movies for inspiration, or when we're the influences of my co-writers and I wish we didn't have to say this, but none of them are necessarily faith-based projects.
Right.
I mean, I say that as someone who's made many faith-based projects over my 20 years in the business, some of which I'm very proud of, but most of them didn't influence this. This was influenced by shows like The Wire and Breaking Bad, and Friday Night Lights.
Yes.
And so I think that's one of the things that is why people are responding the way that they are, is because it feels like a show that they would normally binge watch. And so what you're saying, though, when you said it in the intro, is that most of the people you've been recommending the show to required multiple pushes. That's been the difficulty with this show from the beginning. There's this one pastor of a mega church in Detroit who had me come out to his church and dedicated an entire service, an entire weekend service to The Chosen. He goes, it took me 2 months to watch it because I hate Christian media so much.
No, that's a real thing.
Yeah. And so it has been, you're
fighting the genre, and the vision people have of it.
Yeah. And I think some of that's a little unfair. I mean, there's I think sometimes we Christians tend to be almost harsher on faith-based media even regular people are. I've had non-Christian people tell me, "Oh, I like that movie." I'm like, "Oh, that's good to hear," because I was so embarrassed by it. And they're like, "No, it's fine." I mean, because they realize most media in general sucks. I mean,
it's true.
It's very, 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 very hard to make a good movie and to make a good show. So, so I don't want to be too harsh, but yes, there are a lot of things we have to overcome. One is the lack of quality in Christian media that has happened throughout the decades. Two, the stereotypes about biblical-based projects, that they are boring and that they are formal. And the Bible doesn't necessarily make for great media all the time. And then the biggest thing is time. A lot of people just don't have time to watch new shows. My wife and I are as it stands, have like 5 shows on our queue that people have been recommending to us.
Yeah.
And so we'll get to this a little bit later, but even just the means to watch it, we didn't work with the system necessarily through the traditional channel. We created our own app. And so people are like, "Oh, do I have to download an app?" And you're like, "No, but it's free and it's easy and it connects directly to your device. I promise you it's easy." Yes. But all these hurdles, which is why, interestingly enough, and I don't know if this is a sad or a hopeful thing to say, the virus and people being stuck in their homes has resulted in a bit of a tipping point, mini explosion. People are finally starting to have the time to watch it and are going, "Oh my goodness, this is something that my family can watch," but it's not like a cheesy little kids show. This is the Jesus that I thought I wanted to fall in love with. Yeah, exactly.
So why don't you tell us how this whole project got birthed? Because it's a pretty inspiring story.
There's some miraculous things that are all tied to this.
Yeah. So I'll try to keep it as quick as I can, but it's hard to, because what God has been doing over the last couple of years has been extraordinary. And I think I can safely say without false humility that this is a God story, not a Dallas story. And I think everyone can relate to that moment when you are facing failure. And that's when you actually find God showing up more than ever before. So the slightly longer version of it is that it started several years ago at my church. I had been in Hollywood for 10 years making movies and was doing okay. But a big church in Chicago hired me to be on their staff to make movies within the church structure, movies, short films to help with their productions. And I actually, even though I went to Hollywood and was making movies there, always loved the church and always still loved the concept of a positive relationship between the church and media, as opposed to a very tenuous negative one that has been existing for so many decades. Typically, if you heard about a relationship between the church and movies, it was in the form of a boycott or some sort of protest.
Right.
I was always bummed by that. So this seemed to me like a good opportunity. So I made a couple of short films while I was there, while we were developing this big feature film idea to do through the church, because this was a big church that had means. I mean, their annual operating budget was over $20 million a year. So they had the opportunity to do movies. Well, I did a couple of short films for Good Friday, for Christmas Eve, and most of them were actually from this concept of telling stories of Jesus that I'd heard many times before, but from different perspectives. And one of the short films that I did got in the hands of one of the biggest producers in Hollywood, a guy by the name of Jason Blum, who's well known for doing massively successful horror films. The latest one was Invisible Man, which they did for just a few $1 million, made over $100 million at the box office before the virus hit. Get Out, Us, Insidious, Sinister, Split. I mean, this guy is huge. And he saw one of my short films through a mutual friend and loved it and was interested in the faith-based space. He saw a financial opportunity. WWE, the wrestling company, has a film division. They had worked with Jason on a few projects. He got them to put up all the money. And he said, "Listen, we want to work with you." And I sent him the script that we were developing, and he loved it. They loved it. And it was actually it was set in a church. It was a gospel messaged film. There was no downplaying the message of it. We actually wanted to shoot it at our church in Chicago. They loved all of that. So a horror film company, a wrestling company, and a church in Elgin, Illinois, worked together to make a film called The Resurrection of Gavin Stone. And this was what was so interesting of it was I felt like this is what I'd wanted for 20 years.
Yeah.
I mean, I made it in Hollywood. I had made movies before, and some of them had been successful and had made money, but I hadn't gotten that affirmation from the business that I had sought.
Right.
Totally.
And then it only got better from there. I made the movie. The movie tested better than any movie that Blumhouse or WWE had ever done. They were doing these tests in Orange County. And their plan was to do 5 movies over the next 10 years with me and with our church. And Universal Studios got involved. And it was like Walden Media got into it because they love the movie. I mean, we were like, I was set. My future was locked in. And one of the cool things about it was it sure seemed like God was very much involved, because
felt like a Tyler Perry moment, huh?
Yeah, exactly. And he had used these short films that I had done for my church to allow me this opportunity. So it was really great. And then the movie was released in theaters in January of 2017, and it was a total bomb. Like day one, like within a couple hours, you can tell that the numbers are going to be what they are. And within a couple hours, I went from being a director with a very bright future to a director with no future, because those companies all were like, well, guess we don't know the faith-based business. Guess we're going to go back to doing what we do best. Nice working with you. I mean, they were friendly about it. Right, it was like, yeah, that didn't work. I guess we'll move on. And so I was left. Now I'm just a guy in Chicago working for a church that without the support of Hollywood, and I'm back to square one.
Did you emotionally spiral?
Well, yeah. I mean, I went home middle of the day, from my office. Went home. My wife and I were just kind of in shock. We were crying and praying and confused. Yeah. And that's that moment where you go, I thought God was in this. Like God, why would you take me through all of that only to just drop it all? What purpose does that serve? And my wife felt almost as clearly as if it would have been audible, but God pressing on her heart the story of the feeding of the 5,000, and drove her to that story. And so we read it together, and she said, I'm noticing things about this story that I've never noticed before. And another thing that God was pressing on her heart was the phrase, I do impossible math. Like she just felt that kind of written on her heart from God. I do impossible math. No idea what that meant. But as we were reading the story of the feeding of the 5,000, it seemed to make sense, because what we saw was Jesus said, these people who have been with me for 3 days, these thousands of people, are so hungry that if I send them home to get food, they'll faint along the way. There's something very interesting about him saying that. He knew how hungry they were, and in fact, it was his fault.
Totally.
He's the one who brought them to that place of hunger where they needed food so badly and actually didn't have any. So that's something that I hadn't really noticed before in that story was, he's actually responsible for this current situation. Then it came time to actually feed these people, and he could have just magically waved his hands and created food in their laps. But he had the disciples go find food. He had the disciples distribute the food. He had them do everything that they didn't need him for. So along with that phrase of I do impossible math, we were thinking, oh, maybe this means that God's going to do some miracle with the box office numbers.
Totally.
And before the end of the weekend, we're going to be able to teach those godless Hollywood folks a lesson what miracles are, and God, God's math is not our own. And maybe they're confident that these numbers, because they've been so low in the first couple hours, well, God does impossible math. So don't be surprised if this changes. And that didn't happen.
Totally.
This happens so many times with people I know. They hear or feel something from God, and then it goes the exact opposite direction.
One punch in the gut after another.
Right. And so you think, but what happens is you start to question, because God would never, as we always hear all the time, it's a cliche, God's not the author of chaos. So this chaos and confusion and disappointment that I'm feeling couldn't have come from him, because he's only good. So what have I done wrong, or what if, or maybe God wasn't involved in this. So that night I did what I typically do, and I'm guessing you do because you're an entrepreneur-minded type of person. Both of you seem to be. So I analyzed, and I wrote a 15-page memo. Here's all the things that went wrong. Here's what I did. Here's what others did wrong. So I was up till 4 a.m. doing this, and I was willing to blame myself. I mean, in fact, most of it was hey, I guess, I can point to decisions that I wanted to make that were kept from being made, so I can blame other people for that. But listen, I thought this movie would work. Right. I thought people would want to see it, and they didn't. And that is as much on me as anyone else. And at 4 o'clock in the morning, a Facebook message popped up on my computer from a guy I've never met. He's just someone who's a Facebook friend. I talk to him maybe once a year. Didn't say hi, didn't say how are you, didn't say, hey, heard about the film, or I saw the film. Like, it was simply said, remember, your job is not to feed the 5,000. It's only to provide loaves and fish.
Come on.
And I get emotional even years later, a couple years later thinking about it, because it was that moment when I knew that in my pain, and even just in the last couple of years, God was part of it. And just like in the feeding the 5,000, it may have actually even been, quote unquote, his fault. Like, he brought me to a place that I had to learn that I couldn't have learned any other way. Mm-hmm. And in that moment, I became a different person, because not only did I realize that God was in this from the beginning, but I realized that the way that I handled things, the way that I approached things, was not God's way and was not what God wanted for me. And so I said to him, why are you up at 4 a.m? And he said, well, I'm in Romania. I'm on a different time zone. I said, well, why did you say that? And he goes, oh, that wasn't me. That God told me to tell you that.
Wow.
Come on.
Yeah. I mean, so I was, again, that moment wrecked me in the best way possible. Yeah. And I can define my life as who I was before that moment and who I've been since that moment. And I am someone who takes responsibility for the results. I am someone who is trying to constantly feed the 5,000. And I think even when you're doing something good like ministry, you can get caught up in the results, and you can say, you can justify that by saying, listen, I'm doing something good. Of course I'm supposed to be impactful. Of course I'm supposed to be efficient. And I think it is a good thing to bring sometimes a business mindset to ministry, because you want to make wise decisions. You want to be good, but good at your job and good at your ministry. But when it comes to the responsibility for the impact, that is just not your job. Your job is to make sure that if God decides to multiply those loaves and fish that you have brought, that those loaves and fish are as good and healthy as they can be. And so that's what I realized I had to focus on, was not the feeding of the 5,000, but the loaves and fish that I brought. And so I genuinely, over the next couple of days, became a different person. I got to the place where I genuinely didn't care if I made another movie. I didn't care what my career goals were. They went away and were replaced by whatever God has for me, whatever God has for me, whatever is in front of me. So I even gave a talk. I was asked to be the keynote speaker at this Christian film festival in Texas, and there were like 500 people there, all there to listen to me on one of my speeches. Listen to me give them, a word of advice for the industry. And I got up and I said, listen, I just came off of a career failure. My movie just bombed. I don't have anything for you on how to make successful movies, but I will tell you where I'm at right now is the most joyous that I've ever been.
Wow.
And I told this story because at this point in the story, when I spoke to all these people, I still had an uncertain future. I didn't know what was next.
Right.
And I had people coming up to me. I mean, there was a standing ovation. People were coming up with tears in their eyes about this 45-minute talk that I gave, because I think it spoke to this place of we are so often coming up with career goals and 5-year plans and visions and whatnot. And I was getting up and saying, listen, I have no idea what the next year holds, and I'm great with that. I'm actually better than I've ever been in my career. So the reason that I mentioned how they responded was that what happened next didn't actually change the truth of where I was, which was, if nothing had happened, if I had ended up becoming a manager or a basketball coach, which was one of my other goals in life that I'd had when I was, 15. If that would have happened, I would have been completely okay with that.
That reminds me of our friend Paul Young, who lost everything in his life. And before the Shack launched and everything went off, and he was like, I learned how to come alive in a 900 square foot house. And I didn't care if anything else got successful. I actually was happy.
And that's actually a really good example, because the Shack started out of his garage, self-publishing, and that's how The Chosen began. This is when I realized, okay, I don't have a movie on deck now. I don't have partners in Hollywood, but these short films that I did for my church always did seem to be very life-giving, not only for me, for those who saw them. And so we poured ourselves back into another short film. And so just from my church's Christmas Eve service, I did a short film about the birth of Christ from the perspective of the shepherds. And this was done in like late spring, early summer of 2017. And even though it was a Christmas project, we shot it because we're in Chicago. So we shot it in the spring or summer because we didn't want to shoot this in the winter. And so it was planned to be shown in our Christmas Eve services later that year. Very long story short, the short film got in the hands of a streaming service, and they heard my idea that had been developed. While I was shooting the short film, I was like, why has there never been a show about the life of Christ? Like, why, there's been movies and miniseries, but there's never actually been a show. Because while I was making the short film, I was doing what I typically do. I'm binge watching shows with my wife, and I'm like, I've really grown to love TV, and we're in a golden age of television where you can watch genuinely great cinema in the form of multi-season shows.
Yeah.
And I'm like, this has never been done about Jesus before. There's been these movies and miniseries, but you can really dig into, like, in 20 minutes of the short, because this short film about the birth of Christ was 20 minutes long. I'm like, I feel like I've learned more and explored more about the birth of Christ in 20 minutes than I ever did in Sunday school classes or other portrayals that I've seen of the birth of Christ. So, because we started with that morning with the shepherds, what their lives were like that morning, and going and trying to sell their lambs for sacrifice, and what they were going through. And so that when the birth of Christ happened, and when they were chosen to be witness to the arrival of the King of the world, it was that much more impactful, because we saw kind of how lowly they were leading up to that moment. So again, long story short, I had this idea, but it just was kind of sitting there. I didn't know what to do with it because I didn't really have a future. But the streaming service saw the short film, freaked out about it, heard my idea, freaked out about that, said, we want to get involved. We want to do this. And I got really excited. And then they said, we want to raise the money through crowdfunding. And I got really depressed.
Totally.
Because crowdfunding rarely works. It's usually for small little projects. And it's all, donate this and you'll get a t-shirt and help my project. And I didn't want to be a salesman. I didn't want to be a pitch person for crowdfunding.
Totally.
And the all-time crowdfunding record was $5.7 million from projects that had big fan bases already. Huge. Like Mystery Science Theater 3000. Like, these were successful projects that were just doing new initiatives. And so they went to their fan base and said, come help. And they did. Well, I was coming off of a career failure. I had no crowd. I had no fan base. And I had this 20-minute short film that I did on my friend's farm in Marengo, Illinois. And they said, we think that we can use this and put this out on social media and generate this crowdfund. And I'm like, listen, guys, a show like this, a season of a show, is going to cost several $1 million.
And thank God you said that, so that you actually made it a good show.
Right. Well, yeah, because I can't, because I'm like, listen, the short film that I did on my friend's farm is we're all thrilled with it, but that was done pretty low budget. That's not, I can't take that and make that into a 8-episode show. Yep. Like, we're if we're going to compete with other shows, you can't, like, look, we don't need Game of Thrones money, but we need to at least be able to get real, actors and crew. So, the short film went out on social media. It ended up being viewed upwards. It looks like somewhere around 20 million times. Wow. It got translated into over a dozen languages.
Wow.
And we ended up shattering the all-time crowdfunding record, raising over $10 million from 19,000 people around the world.
Wow.
And the reason that happened was because when I first heard about the idea of crowdfunding, and it was ridiculous, and I thought it was a dumb idea, and I thought we'd be lucky to raise $100,000.
Totally.
I also said, loaves and fishes, man. Like, it's not my job to feed the 5,000. I'm not going to resist some idea because I think it's stupid. Because what do I know?
Right.
Like, I'm clearly not as smart as I thought I was. And again, in this new personhood that I had embraced, and this relationship with God that I had embraced of, it's not my job to feed the 5,000. It's only to provide the loaves and fish. I'm like, all right, well, I'm just going to provide the loaves and fish. This is my loaf and one fish in this short film that I'm doing, and we'll see what God wants to do with it. And he doesn't. I mean, while that was happening, I was also looking for other work because I had decided to leave the church that I was working at anyway for other reasons. And so I ended up leaving my job and benefits. I had no source of income other than the hope that this. Now, by the way, when I left, the actual funding hadn't happened yet. Like, right. We had to submit to the SEC. It took 5 months because this is an investment, it's an investment, not a donation. So SEC regulated and all that. So when I left my job, we didn't have benefits. We didn't have a stable source of income. We had raised just enough from a couple of investors so that I could maybe start writing episodes to get ahead of things, but that was just small. And of course, at that time, my family then had more health problems than we'd had in 20 years of marriage.
And you have 4 kids, so it wasn't like
I had an emergency appendectomy. We ran up over $100,000 in hospital bills, but we also embraced, not to do this plug, but we embraced this Samaritan Ministries health.
Oh yeah,
you've heard about these things, probably, where they're like almost like Christian co-ops. Yeah, and so we actually were. Literally every penny was paid for.
That's amazing.
And covered by others. And it was just that's a whole story in and of itself. But yeah, we were just in this kind of daily manna program, which is how my wife describes it, where like God told the Israelites, I'm going to bring you daily manna, but don't store it up, because if you do, I'm going to make it rot. I want you daily dependent on me. And so we came out every morning, with our hands outstretched, looking for provision. Yeah. And it came in abundance and overwhelmed my expectations for the show. And so now, as I talk to you, season 1 was financed, filmed. We had the ability, again, still relatively low budget for Hollywood standards, but we had enough to make a show that holds up. And so as I'm sitting to you, you have watched season 1. Yep. People are watching season 1 around the world. We are literally in every single country around the world. It's being translated to dozens of languages as we speak. And lives have been impacted and changed at a rate that I haven't seen with a project like this. And it's just been extraordinary to watch and humbling.
Absolutely.
And shame on me if I ever get to a place where I forget where this all started. I am, the success of the show has not gotten me to a place of, oh wow, I guess I'm better than I thought I was. This show is way better than I am. The experience is way bigger than I expected. My expectations for it were not what's happening and where it seems to be leading right now. So, believe me, if those who've said, hey, I get this all the time, like, hey, don't let this get to your head. I'm like, hey, you don't have to worry about that.
I was broken to pieces before this started.
Absolutely. And when I'm writing it, that's the other cool thing that has happened is when I've been writing, about once a week, there will be some little nugget in a scene that just kind of comes to me out of the blue. And I'll write it and I'll get emotional writing it. It's little things like Jesus winking in episode 2.
Oh my gosh. One of our favorite he did that moments.
Right. So I didn't even know that you felt that way, but here's why that's not surprising, is because that's an example of what, when it came to me and I thought, because I came up with this joke for a guy to make fun of Jesus, basically. And everyone around him kind of like gets nervous and scared because they're making fun of the Son of God.
Right.
And he laughs and winks at the guy who told the joke. And I thought, oh, that's so great and so cool. And then I told my wife, and she actually got emotional about it. She's like, oh, that's so precious. And yet, and then people respond to that little thing. It's just a little moment, the same way that you just did. And I'm like, you responded the same way that I did, which affirms that God is doing these little things and has a story to tell in this show. And it's like, it's almost every episode, there's a little moment like that seems innocuous, that people are responding to in the same way that I did when I heard the idea. And I feel like the best thing that I'm doing in this show is listening. I feel like I'm never going to claim, inspiration from God. This isn't scripture. I'm not a gospel writer.
No.
This isn't the Bible. And I'm not one of those. I'm always skeptical of ministry leaders who are like, listen, my ministry is ordained by God. It's anointed. So you need to
totally.
All I'm going to do is tell you what's happening. And I feel like the responses that people are having to these little moments are the same responses that I'm having. And so I feel like God has something to say about his people and stories to tell about these real people that existed who were, for whatever reason, at low points in their lives and with huge struggles and sin patterns, chosen by God to be his direct followers and to start the church of the world. And I'm just trying to listen to who God seems to be indicating that they were.
Well, this is why. So many of my friends I make them watch it because I want to talk about it with people. I want to actually be like, do you remember this part? I could go through every episode and probably tell you all of the things that like were those moments. And it's like fun. I have friends that are like, we got to start a small group around this. Like so many people, because something that's happening is you actually believe if God chose them, he could choose me.
Right.
If God saw them and how messy they were and he liked them and he was happy to be with them, and he never thought that somebody was too bad or too broken, or like he came for every situation. It just makes him so accessible, compassionate. And one of the things that I think has been missing, and this is what I love, is that he was like happy and like relatable and fun. There's so many scenes where you're like, yes, that's a person I would, because, and I've talked about this before when in preaching, where I'm like, no, people liked being around him. Sinners liked being around him. People who could party liked being around him. So he had to have been fun. This idea that we have of super stoic God is completely wrong, because he's a fun, Anyway, could you tell us?
Well,
I was just going to say, could you tell us a couple story, or you can say something on that if you want.
I'll say this real quick, because I think one of the things you might be thinking of too is episode 5, which is the wedding at Cana. And when we dig into that, like, so my wife, she wrote the devotional book that is the companion to the show. And when she's digging into the story and we're digging into the story to capture it, you find these really fascinating cultural and historical details that you don't normally think of that make those stories even more impactful. So the wedding at Cana, when you really break it down, was Jesus was doing a favor for his friends because his mom asked him to. Jesus didn't necessarily do these big, huge miracles that he could have done that reached thousands of people at once. That he did do that as well, but most of the miracles were personal. And his mom came to him and said, "Your friends are embarrassed because they've run out of wine," which was a huge cultural faux pas. And he's like, "What does this have to do with me?" He kind of plays the coy, because he's like, my time hasn't come yet. This is a small matter and she's like, please, she's like, listen, and we don't know exactly all of the things that she said to him.
Sure.
But when we are doing the episode, we created what we believe is a plausible scenario for the kind of conversations that they would have had. And so, but that's not the end of the story. So once the wine comes and everyone is having the greatest wine of their lives, what we know about Jewish weddings was that they were crazy. I mean, they were dancing and laughing, and they lasted for several days.
Yes.
So why shouldn't we see Jesus dance with his friends and making jokes about one of his friends who sucks at dancing? Like all of those things go into it. And so we wanted to portray that. And that's that's the joy piece that I think you're responding to, that the gospel writers didn't see fit to say, oh, and by the way, Jesus laughed when he danced. That's not necessarily an important part of the history of the world, but it does give you, I think when we're doing a show, we can include some of those little things that I think enhance some of the big moments as well.
Yeah, so there's some great jokes through the whole series, I thought, and the banter between the disciples, and it makes you start thinking, like, I remember, oh, there's a couple brothers in the disciples. That'd be complicated to have your family with you. And like, it makes you what it does is it makes you be interested. I started looking up all kinds of things in the Bible after watching it, because I'm like, oh, I didn't know that. Oh, is that what that is? Oh, I've never thought about this angle. And it's just putting humanity back. But will you give us a couple cool stories that have happened around this project?
Yeah, well, besides the fact that the entire thing was birthed out of failure, which I've already shared, I think there's two things that really stand out when I think of how the story of the making of this show is at times as a reflection of what God is doing as the content of the show itself. One is the filming itself. There's a video that we released telling the story that I'll tell you briefly, which is in episode 4, and not to give a spoiler away, but this story is in the Gospels, so I think most people know it, which is when Jesus calls Simon to follow him, it comes on the heels of Simon being up all night, not having been able to catch one fish, and he's desperate. And we portray over the course of a couple episodes why he would have been so desperate to catch fish, and why that was so important to his livelihood in the midst of oppression. And Jesus comes along and says, try again. And Simon's like, this is ridiculous. It won't work. And of course, he's overwhelmed with more fish than he can even contain. And so it's known, obviously, as the miracle of the fish. Yeah. And the filming of the miracle of the fish, when the week before we filmed it was Thanksgiving week. And so we had actually taken a break in filming, and everyone kind of went home for a week. And on the day before Thanksgiving, which was a Wednesday, we were going to be filming in 5 days. We didn't have fish. We didn't have a boat. We didn't have a lake. We didn't have a lake to film on. The lake that we wanted to film on had been flooded because there had been more rain in Texas than had ever been in 50 years. So it had flooded the beach, basically, or whatever, the shore had been flooded. So it was going down each day a couple feet because the rains had stopped, but we didn't know for sure if by Monday morning when we showed up to film, it was going to be down where we needed it. The boat, we had been looking for a Jesus boat, as they call it, a boat that looks like it's from 2,000 years ago. All over the world, every single option that we pursued fell through, or it was too expensive.
2,000-year-old boat on eBay.
Right. Well, there are, you'd be surprised, but there are boats that have been built to kind of recreate that, but we just couldn't get them for whatever reason. I can't even explain it to you. Everyone fell through. So, and then we would say, well, can people build a boat like that? And they were like, no, it'll take several months. Well, our production designer, his construction guy was like, I think I have a few guys who can help. I think we can do this in a few weeks. So a few weeks before we were scheduled to shoot that scene, they just started building 2 boats because there were 2 boats in the scene. And so a few days before, they were still working. They weren't sure. We knew we could probably have one maybe ready, but the paint would still be, drying on the boat. I mean, they were working around the clock.
Wow.
And then the fish. We had worked with all these fish companies to try to get a bunch of fish, that we were going to dump into the lake at this time and hold, with a tank. And then really, every option fell through. And so the final option on Wednesday fell through. The alternative lake that we were going to try to use, that was ready for us to use, fell through. So I'm literally like, I don't have anything. I don't have fish. I don't have a boat. I don't have lake. But I'm telling you, I had this sense of peace that was born out of what had happened 2 years earlier. I was just like, loaves and fishes, man. Yep. Like, not my job.
Not my job to take care of that.
It's only my job to provide the loaves and fish. Now, ironically enough, in this case, I don't even have fish to bring. Like, I have like half of a loaf and no fish. And my visual effects team said, started talking. I went to them and I was like, can you create fish out of nowhere? And they're like, yeah, well, I mean, having fish that are moving and look like they're alive, I mean, that's not easy, but I think we could conceivably do it if we had the right circumstances. So we came up with these ideas to create this green tarp, basically, this big green tarp that would wrap around some water balloons so that it would feel heavy and it would sink, it would be in the water. It would float a little bit, but be heavy enough to feel like a big catch of fish. We're going to put that into the net that these guys are using to capture the fish. And so we ended up calling it the green burrito because it was ridiculous. But if these guys can treat it like though they're fish and push this big heavy thing, if they can get it into the boat, we think we can turn that into a bunch of fish. Now, I thought, again, just like with crowdfunding, I thought it was a ridiculous idea. And as a director, I'm not comfortable with filming things that are out of my control, meaning I can't, this isn't tangible. I'm not going to see these fish until 5 months from now. I don't know if they're going to look good. Right. And here I am filming this entire scene, the most important scene in the show, the most joyous scene in the show, the scene that's supposed to result in these guys laughing and crying and all this stuff. It's with this green burrito. So the morning of, the lake got down to the level that we needed it. The boat came around the corner of the lake, showing up, being tugged by this motorboat that, again, literally the paint was drying on it as we pulled up. They got the green burrito, into the water and shot this whole scene. And I'm like, I have no idea if this is going to be ridiculous or if it's going to be, the best scene of all time. And again, long story short, even the guys, when they were making the visual effects team, when they were making the fish, had struggles that they hadn't experienced before. And at every stage, it was like never going to be easy. God just refused to let us relax or sleep well. And at one point, the visual effects guy even called me and said, I don't know, dude, I may not be able to pull this off. And I'm like, loaves and fishes, man, literally, like, I don't know, I can't worry about it. I've done everything that I can do. I've done the part that I was asked to do.
Which I have power over.
Exactly. So when you watch episode 4, and when I was seeing it for the first time myself, I would be surprised if anyone watched it saying, "Oh, those are fake fish." Like they look like legitimate, real fish. They're bouncing off of people's heads.
No, I gotta interrupt you, because actually, when I watched it, because I looked through a filmmaker standpoint, like, I gotta reinforce, it's not just you as a director telling people like, no, this looks real. No, I literally, in that moment, as I was watching it, thought, those look so real. How did they do this? I have to know.
Did they get a ton of fish?
Did they get a whole ton of fish? How did they get all those fish in there? And how did they lift them up? Like, I literally had that moment because that's how I function. So I love that you answered that, because it literally went through my head.
Yeah. And that's what this project has been happening to this project from moment one, is every time that I try to solve big problems myself, or we think that we've got the solution to something and it doesn't work, 9 times out of 10, it's because our ideas were not nearly as good as what God was going to do. And that brings me to the second thing that has been quote unquote God stories, is the casting.
Before you say this, I just have to say the casting is so good.
Every single person. It's like Jesus feels actually like Jesus. I think it might actually be Jesus.
I have a crush on Jesus. Is that normal? I think if we all met him as an actor, we would all run and hug him. And he'd be like, oh.
Well, he gets that a lot. And his name is Jonathan Rumi. I actually met him when I cast him as Jesus 5 or 6 years ago for that first short film that I did for my church. And I remember when I cast him, actually, spiritually at the time, he was a bit of a lapsed Catholic. He wasn't very engaged spiritually, but this project and performing as Jesus over the course of the last few years has brought him back to Jesus and back to God more than ever before.
Oh, I bet.
But I remember when I was watching the filming, when we were filming one of the scenes years ago, I was like, this is the best portrayal of Jesus that I've ever seen.
Yes.
And he has a great story himself of when he was a kid and he saw the movie Jesus of Nazareth for the first time. He felt I don't know if he calls it a vision or a dream of he felt like this notion of portraying Jesus himself.
This is insane.
That is crazy.
he built a cross in his backyard and like imagined himself being filmed. Like this is when he was 10 years old.
No.
It's somewhat of a it sounds like a morbid story. But he said he can look back throughout his life and he's felt this calling since he was a kid, even when he wasn't fully aware of it. He said, when I was 10 years old, I felt this like desire to kind of reenact or experience what Jesus did in some way. But the casting, there have been multiple times where, again, for example, real quick example, the actor who plays John the Baptist. Oh,
one of the best cast people on the show. Yeah. We watched him. We were like, that's exactly it.
He has to be that way.
Right. So I would love to take full credit for that. And say, that was one where I really made a good decision. Well, we had him cast almost officially as Matthew when he first auditioned. He was our Matthew, and my wife loved him because my wife is huge in the casting process because she has extraordinarily good instincts. And so she was like, she loved him. I loved him. The casting director, he was so quirky and interesting as Matthew. And then she just kept saying, I have a check in my spirit, like something. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, we love this guy. She's like, I don't know if he's right for this. He's right for maybe who Matthew is when we first meet him, but I don't know that he's going to be the Matthew that Matthew becomes. And I'm like, you're going to have to give me better, evidence than that. She's like, I don't really have it for you. I just feel this check in my spirit. So there was another guy who had auditioned for Matthew, but it had been not a great audition. And she's like, try him again. So we did, and it's Paras Patel, who we ended up casting as Matthew.
He's amazing.
I'm so endeared towards him. I just love him.
Right, and we decided to portray Matthew as having Asperger's syndrome.
I was like, it's autism or Asperger's or something.
Relatable.
It's so relatable.
Right, because we were trying to give humanity to the disciples, because one of my good friends said, in most Jesus projects, there's 3 disciples. There's Simon, who's really, because he's the most famous one. Yeah. There's Judas, because he's the betrayer. Right. And then there's the other 10 disciples. They're all one. They all look the same. They talk the same.
Totally.
There's no real personality. So when we wanted to really give humanity and a backstory and a personality to these individual disciples, we thought it was really interesting for Matthew, who, we know was a numbers guy because he was a tax collector and an accountant. He was a facts guy because his first chapter of his book is just a genealogy. And he also chose a profession that made him a social outcast. And so we thought, well, let's just, and I'm very familiar with autism and Asperger's. I've volunteered a lot in it. I have a daughter who's autistic. Wow. So I knew how to write that.
Yes.
Paras' portrayal can only be described as almost, it's almost
so good.
It's almost like supernatural how wonderful it is. And then I was like, oh, well, this David guy who we almost cast as Matthew would be perfect as John the Baptist. And again, it's just an example of the decisions that we made that we thought were really smart. Some of them turned out to be great, but a lot of them were like, no, that's not what I have for you. And that goes back to, and this is I think the final thing I'll say on this whole project is when I was in Israel in 2018 doing research before we filmed, I'd never been to Israel and I wanted to go to the place where Jesus walked. I wanted to be, I couldn't not do this show without having been there. And I went with a Messianic Jewish rabbi named Jason.
I love Jason.
We did a bunch of videos about capturing our experience. And the first couple of days were great, but I didn't have that moment that so many people describe where, you're in Israel and you're in the Holy Land and God is just present with you and you just get swept away. I hadn't fully had that moment until I went to Magdala, and that's the place of Mary Magdalene's birth. And I was there at a synagogue that they had found just recently. And it was a synagogue that Jesus clearly had been in at some point. It was very obvious. And this was a synagogue in Magdala. And that's when it really hit me. And I felt like God, again, I don't experience God's voice audibly. I don't have visions or anything like that. But there's been a handful of times in my life where God has pressed on my heart as clearly as if he had spoken audibly. And I got this message from the Lord on my heart that was like, these are my people that you are going to be portraying. This is going to be, again, it wasn't maybe this explicit, but it was like, I got this feeling like this is going to be the portrayal of my people that is known as the most, the definitive portrayal of who my people are.
Right.
and I'm not going to let you screw it up.
Wow.
So I felt both this fear and comfort at the same time.
Yes.
Because it was like, again, I don't predict success for very good reasons, as you've heard. But I tend to be a relatively measured, skeptical guy when it comes to the future, to success. I tend to just take things as they come. But I felt like in 2018, before the show even came out, I got this impression of like, this is going to be known as the portrayal of my people. Like when people think of Matthew and Mary Magdalene and Nicodemus and Jesus, and like, this is what they're going to think of. This is the picture they're going to have in their heads. Fast forward 2 years later, I've heard, I'm not exaggerating, on social media or email or whatever, from thousands of people who said, when I'm reading my Bible, I'm picturing now these portrayals. And God said, because of that, I'm not going to let you screw it up. And so that is why I believe that so many of these casting decisions have not been screwed up by my own wisdom, so-called. Because even though I'm pretty good at casting, and I think that's a strength of mine as a filmmaker, there have been enough times when I wanted to go or thought I should go in one direction, and God just didn't let me. And that has happened so many times on this project, whether it was with the miracle of the fish or the casting or whatever. That is the story of God in this project, is that so many times when we have gone a specific direction that wasn't right, God didn't let us go there. Something happened for whatever reason to push us into the right direction. And the response of the people who've seen it, who've said, I can only describe it as my heart has been changed. My heart is connected to this show. I don't know why. I can't explain it. I have to talk about it. I have to be involved. I have to give money. I have to do whatever. I've never done this before, but I have to. That's a God thing. That's not Dallas Jenkins making a cool show that people like. That's God having a story to tell, and the best thing I'm doing is listening and then getting out of the way when necessary.
This is so good.
You go ahead.
I was going to, go ahead. What were you?
Okay, I was just going to say, yes, when we finished watching this.
Okay, I was going to say the same thing.
Go ahead.
I literally had the same thing on my head. Like when you talk about people having to support and jump in, like there's this, there's an app that you actually download for it, and you can share a little bit about that in a second, but there's this pay it forward option so that you can pay for other people to watch it. I went and immediately dropped a large chunk of change, and I was like, I have to support this. I just have to have it.
We need to make season 2
I've never had any emotion like that over something where I'm like, here, take it, go make season 2. And it was just actually selfish purposes because I have to see what happens.
Yes, I want to see this become an 8-season series. I want. That's why I'm like, we got to send it to all our rich friends for sure. We got to, but like, I'm joking about that, but we instantly wanted to, and I'm encouraging my friends, I'm encouraging people like, no, give to it. Even if you give the littlest amount, what people don't understand is big numbers of people giving little amounts creates a huge wave. So whatever you have, go ahead and support this.
There's a Bible verse in Isaiah 43 that says, Isaiah 43:19, behold, I am doing a new thing. Can you not perceive it? And that's what's been happening with this show from the beginning. So the way it was financed, season 1 was financed as an investment thing, shattered the all-time crowdfunding record. That's a new thing. The content itself, that it's the first ever multi-season show, that's new. The way that it's been distributed, there's an app, called The Chosen, that it's a good name for it, that the distributors created, called The Chosen, and it's free, and you download it to your phone. It connects directly to your streaming device. It's literally unprecedented technology.
It's brilliant. No, I've thought that too. I'm like, these guys captured something with this app that everyone else needs to get on board with. Just the app alone, I was mind blowing.
Well, because I could go to your house and get on your Wi-Fi and connect the show to your Roku or Fire Stick or Apple TV, or of course your own at your own house. And so people sometimes who get intimidated by technology, or who say, "Oh, why can't I just watch it on Netflix?" Well, no, this is even in some ways even better because there's no subscription, there's no payment or anything. When we decided to make it free, it didn't make sense because streaming costs money. You guys are podcasters. You understand that. Every time someone streams a podcast or streams a show, it actually costs money. But what we did was, that brings us to the next thing that's new, is this pay it forward model. Is we just realized that every single time that we decided to give something away for free from the show, it ended up resulting in more income coming in. Because when people see it, they have the response that you did.
Yep.
And I don't take credit for it. I'm just reporting the facts. Is when people see it, even at the investment round, when they watched that short film about the birth of Christ, they said, I've never done this before. I felt compelled in my heart, like I had no choice. I had to be involved. I had to invest. And so even just last night, we did a live stream free around the world on YouTube showing an episode. And again, it's free. We were showing it. And this is while people are stuck in their homes, some of whom don't have a job right now and are struggling.
Totally.
And they're watching the show more than ever, which is costing us more money than ever. And yet I can't explain it, but the pay it forwards have come in at a greater rate in the last 2 weeks than ever before. And the show is growing faster than ever before. And so this pay it forward plan, where the money goes towards offsetting the cost of streaming, giving it away. The people in China can watch this for free.
Yeah.
We had this mother from China who said, my husband and kids don't speak English. They just binged watched all 8 episodes, even though they don't understand the language, because they spiritually moved by this.
Wow.
She's like, I'm trying to help translate while they're watching. And my kids are watching. My kids, I didn't know kids would like this show. It feels like an adult show.
Right.
5-year-olds are watching, saying, I want to watch the next Jesus show, Mommy. I want to see the next episode. It knocks me on my butt every time I hear it. It's hard to talk about without crying, because kids are seeing the authentic Jesus that I didn't get a chance to see on film when I was a kid. But I think there's something about God's story that is breaking down cultural barriers. It's breaking down neurological barriers. Special needs people are watching the show. We have this 22-year-old this 22-year-old autistic guy, severely autistic, who obviously can connect with Matthew, who's not severe, but for whatever reason, his mom sent me this video of him just saying every night, Jesus show, Mom, Jesus show. It's breaking down age barriers. And so I think what's happening is God is compelling those who have the means to give, or to potentially invest. We'll probably be opening another investment round here relatively soon. But in some way, they feel those who have means financially are compelled to give.
Yes.
Those who don't but have means, or who are social media savvy, they're going social media about it. Prayer warriors are praying about the show, but there's something that God's show that is bigger than I am and bigger than you are. But I think we're all putting our loaves and fishes in, and you, Justin, have the ability to do it in your way through this podcast and through some financial means. I'm doing it in my way, and others are doing it in their way, and we're watching God feed the 5,000 together.
I love that.
So, Dallas, I know you have to go, and we want to respect your time. So we just really want to say thank you. Thank you for the efforts, the places you laid down your life, the places that you submitted your heart and went on a process, the breaking process, and the process of not giving up. And I think your story transcends just the story of the chosen. It actually speaks to the human condition of like, hey, when we actually trust our lives with Papa and we just go, all right, Dad, I'm in. Let me go on a journey with you, and I'm going to risk it, that there's beauty that comes out of it, even the most tragic moments that we feel are happening in our experience.
And I feel like your story is just so hopeful for right now, because there's so many people, their future is unknown. There's uncertainty with the coronavirus and everything that's happening with jobs. And your story is such a story of hope that you can trust that good things are around the bend, even when it looks like there's no answers and things aren't going to work out. So thank you so much for sharing it. It's so full of hope and life and goodness. And it's just such an honor to meet you. And
it was a serious gift.
We're in for all the seasons.
Yeah. So thanks for joining us. And maybe when season 2's out, we can talk again about it, huh?
Well, and maybe we should talk on the set. So you guys got to get out there. So we'll get you out.
Yes. We'll do one live.
All right, Dallas, you have a good day, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, you too.
Bye now.
Gosh, I loved that.
Yeah, that was so incredible.
So inspiring.
Yeah.
Okay, really quick. One of the reasons we loved The Chosen so much is it put compassion back into the story of God and humanity. It made you feel compassion from God. It made you understand compassion for humans.
It made you understand that God is compassion.
Yeah. And so we just wanted to quickly say we have the Compassion Project out. Currently, it is on a sale. You can do the code, which is
toilet paper. And
aptly named for the coronavirus shortage.
And there's a 20% off sale on that. for 1 week.
Yes, because we are so excited about compassion being infused into society, back into homes. We know compassion heals the human heart. I'm just reading this book that talks about how the human heart needs love to become a being, not a doing.
Yep.
And compassion gets us back to that place. That's why we loved this show. So if you need more compassion in your life, to experience it more from God, from yourself, from others, to give it to others, we think you should get this project.
Yeah. So jump on that, stumblconsulting.com/courses/the Compassion Project. And you can go check that out. And now's the time to get inspired, to become hopeful, and to come alive with love in this season. So peace out.